I got in hot water recently saying that dairy is contraindicated, purportedly. Depends on what you really mean by contraindicated. And really what I should say is it really depends on what kind of dairy we're talking about more than anything. According to the principles of evolutionary adaptation and the principles of evolutionary indication, we have been consuming dairy in any form at all for the exact amount of time, roughly speaking, that we have been consuming plants in any significant amount. Therefore, we can say that our genes perhaps have not actually become familiar with withstanding dairy to a degree that would confer indication upon dairy, so to speak. That is a fact, and that is something to keep in mind and remember. However, we can look at other things besides evolution. Pasteurization seems to cause people issues with dairy because of the denaturing and killing off of certain bacteria and enzymes that are involved in breaking down lactose, actually, like lactase, that is inherent in raw milk. And people seem to not stomach it too well, from my personal experience with talking to other people. This could be something that would indicate dairy's contraindication. However, it doesn't really do that at all, because that's not dairy's fault, that's humans' fault, or faults. There's also a problem with casein, it seems, A1. Casein A1 seems to cause people issues, and whenever they transition to casein A2, not a problem. In fact, I wrote about this in my book, Contraindicated. Second edition in all formats, by the time you're watching this, should be out. The only problem may be with the ebook by the time you're watching. All the other three are out. Link in the description to those. But there was a genetic mutation that occurred ostensibly due to crossbreeding cows by humans that made it to where the casein protein produced in milk products was no longer casein A2, but casein A1. This can cause issues for people. However, that just means that A1 dairy may be contraindicated. In fact, I believe it is. But A2 is totally fine. There's another problem with a lot of dairy products. The carbohydrate content, I don't really think I need to get into that at all in this video, considering most of you guys that are watching already know my position on things. Carbohydrates are not required for human consumption at above a certain physiological concentration within the bloodstream that is most conducively achieved by consuming it, or them, is toxic, evinced by diabetes, for example. However, there are certain dairy products that do not have carbohydrates in them, so you can use those. However, I would like to say that there is an argument to make that if you have to do something so much to a certain food to make it edible, then that might be an indication that you shouldn't be consuming it. If you can't consume it in its rawest, most purest form, while maintaining the most optimal level of indication for your species, dietarily speaking, that is an inference to make. And finally, a very important detail is the fact that casein itself, irrespective of whether it is A2 or A1, breaks down into casomorphin, which is, hence the name, morphine, and has very similar effects on the brain that are addictive. In fact, it's just what I say all the time on this channel. The best way to overeat on meat, overeating, defined as eating more than you actually require, is to either put a bunch of honey on it, or sugar, pair it with sugar, basically. Pair it with something sweet, even if it's not sugar, like a sweetener, for example, an artificial one or a natural one, or put a shitload of cheese on it. There's a reason for that. So, with that out of the way, I know that this is quite a contentious viewpoint, but I don't think that dairy is an optimal choice for people. In fact, Ken Berry shares this sentiment, except he has a far larger following, and I think a lot of people will give him more grace than they would me, with a mere 8,400 subscribers. But it's just my opinion. What I will say is there are a lot of pros to dairy. First of all, nutrient density is an aspect when it comes to dairy, especially if you compare it to other plant products. Also, the lack of plant toxins, as long as you get grass-fed dairy, because if you don't, then it can have lectins in the milk. Fat and protein as macronutrients as well, so it already ties into nutrient density. There's many pros to dairy, in fact, but I think that there may very well be more cons than pros. If you are insisting upon consuming dairy, which, by the way, I do as well, I'm just trying to cut the habit. Butter is a different story. I don't really know if I'm ever going to cut butter out because it doesn't share many of the same cons as other dairy products do. If you insist on consuming dairy products, prioritizing grass-fed, A2, raw dairy with no lactose in it is your best bet. So, I hope that clears things up. I'd like to hear your opinions in the comments section, but this is a very consistent position based on my overall positions, my foundational positions of what is indicated for human beings. So, join me next time when I'm either monologuing about stuff like this or I'm taking the piss out of someone else. that doesn't really understand anything about science, statistical interpretation, acid-base balance, maybe. I don't know. Till then.